Hello everyone, this is My Two Cents. Welcome back to my channel. A while back now, I made a video collaboration with Night Shift 10,000 called Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the New Spectrum of Privilege. And what we talked about in that video is how Karl Marx originally introduced the idea of class theory. All of history is explained as a class struggle, and the two classes are rich versus poor. And really used that as the catalyst for his movement, by which blaming everything on the oppressor class is how you get people to give up their freedom to the state to consolidate power and advance the agenda of the people within power. But how in today's day and age, the original two-class system that Marx proposed, which was just rich and poor, has been expanded to this spectrum of privilege, where basically you have the privileged class, the white cisgendered male, the oppressed class, the black, female, transgender, whatever else you have, and then everywhere in between, you're either closer to the most privileged or you're the least privileged. And this is the new narrative by which the state manufactures more tragedies, more need to for people to give up their freedom so that they can crush this imaginary enemy, because they know that people aren't going to willingly give up their freedoms unless they can convince them there exists some kind of existential threat for which that must be destroyed. And this week we had an excellent example of this in action, that being the whole situation that took place in Atlanta. Now, taking a look at this article from the New York Times, 8 dead in Atlanta spa tragedy with fears of anti-Asian bias. Of course, you don't have to read very far to realize that with fears of anti-Asian bias are completely unwarranted. So, the article here. The man who police say went on a rampage at 3 spas in the Atlanta area has been charged with 8 counts in connection with the attacks. The suspect in the attacks has been charged. This took the lives of 6 women of Asian descent, which stirred considerable outrage and fear in the Asian American community. And of course, if you take a look at Twitter and every other mainstream media outlets, and even I know at least a couple of states have put their flags to half-staff in solidarity with the Asian American community. President Biden has spoken out in his support of the Asian American community. Yet, is there any actual evidence that this incident, while a tragedy, was carried out by a white cisgendered male who just hated people of other races, particularly Asians? No. In fact, it says right here in the same article, the suspect told police that he had a sexual addiction and had carried out the shootings at the massage parlors to eliminate his, quote, temptation. He also said that he had frequented massage parlors in the past and launched attacks as a form of vengeance. All but one of the victims were women, the police said. Yeah, well, they'll neglect to tell you here that one of the women was a white woman, and then the other was a Hispanic male. So no, not all the victims were Asian, and he explicitly said the reason he did this is because he had an addiction, and he felt the only way to get rid of it was to attack all the people here. Never mind the fact, we go just a little bit further, find out that he was on his way to Florida after this. Captain Jay Baker of the Cherokee County Sheriff's Office said that Mr. Long had told police he was driving to Florida when he was caught after the event on Tuesday evening, and he said he may have been trying to commit similar incidents at a business connected to the porn industry. So he attacked massage parlors, he was going to attack the porn industry, and he was trying to eliminate temptation. I know others have testified that this individual was extremely religious, had been to rehab for sexual addiction. Here, I'll go ahead and there's an article at the Federalist that has consolidated this pretty well, so we'll go ahead and switch over to this one. So here we have John Daniel Davidson writing at the Federalist. He's consolidated from CNN, an article that on CNN and Reuters, where the suspect's roommate said that the individual was a recovering addict. He frequented these massage parlors for explicitly sexual activity. And the roommate also said that he was deeply religious and very emotionally distraught that he frequented these places. Another former roommate who spoke to CNN on condition of anonymity said that the individual went twice to rehab last year. The roommate reportedly lived with the individual for several months in summer 2020 at a transition house for people exiting rehab, and called police after recognizing the individual on the surveillance photo. So again, what we've got going on here is we have a pretty, I mean, does this prove definitively that racism wasn't a factor? No, it doesn't, but we've got consistent testimony from individuals who knew the suspect. We've got the suspect's own testimony saying pretty clearly here that his motivation for doing this was he had an addiction, and he felt the only way to get rid of his addiction was to attack these places. Now, is that very logical? No, but what is clear is that he was not motivated by the fact that the majority of his victims, not all of them, mind you, the majority, were Asian women. Yet, of course, the mainstream media can't let this go to waste, because the narrative they are trying to create is that there is an existential threat of white supremacy in the nation today. I know I go to the gym every morning, and at the gym I've been going to over the past couple of days, I've noticed that TVs they have playing, there's a particular ad that keeps coming on for a documentary called Homegrown Hate, documenting the rise of white supremacy and hatred in the United States, and how this is such a growing threat. If we don't do something about it, you know, these people could rise up and overthrow the government, as was the narrative in the Capitol riot. Never mind when Black Lives Matter and Antifa commit riots in far greater magnitude than anything any white supremacist has ever managed to throw. The mainstream media completely ignores it. And that, of course, is because of this cultural Marxism. The state is continuing to try and consolidate as much power as it can over the people. We've seen how they've exploited the COVID-19, or I really should say not exploited, created the COVID-19 crisis in order to do this. They are seeking to prolong it, even though it's becoming very clear that with vaccines having been released and places like Texas removing their mask mandate, more and more people going back to work, it remains to be seen how long they can exploit that tragedy. So they're trying to create more tragedies, in particular this class-based tragedy, which is a playbook from Karl Marx, except framed in terms of cis-gendered white males versus everyone else. And even though this is one guy with an addiction who attacks and kills 8 people, Yet this is emblematic of this greater problem that we just have to give the government increasing power in order to stop. And I see J.C. Armitage has said here, anyone else think this was a false flag? Well, you know, I'm not in any position to say, but whether it was or not, it is definitely an opportunity that they're exploiting to push their narrative for the state to consolidate its power. This is a perfect example of cultural Marxism in action, and how this class theory is us versus them dynamic is utilized to stoke fear and get people to willingly give up, accept more and more the government having more and more control over their lives. So that's all I really have to say on this. I know, despite the fact, no matter what comes out, they're never going to let this go. We've seen that with every other tragedy like this. Even when you can definitively prove that racism was not a factor, they will never let go of the narrative. For the next 5 years, this is going to be cited as yet another example of the white supremacy taking over the nation, which we must, of course, grant the government increased police powers and surveillance powers in order to deal with that threat. And, of course, the government knows with the stimulus checks it just released. This is a separate issue, but it's related broadly. Peter Schiff, in his podcast this past week, was talking about how with the stimulus checks now having been released, every American taxpayer is basically on the hook for another $50,000 of debt. So you may have gotten $1,400 or $2,800 or however much you got because of your child tax credits or anything else. But don't hold your breath. And don't celebrate, because the government, one, printed all that money, which means it's just going to lead to more inflation, and, of course, incurred more debt, which puts every American taxpayer on the hook for at least another $50,000, more than the annual salary than quite a few of those American taxpayers, I'm going to guess, which means that the window with which the government can control the pending hyperinflation is getting smaller and smaller. Obviously, they are going to try to create more tragedies like this one, like bombing Syria, like extending the COVID-19 tragedy, in hopes that perhaps with enough fear, people will save money as opposed to spend it, and they can stave it off long enough to come up with a plan. But make no mistake, it is it is absolutely coming. And all these things, different issues, are interrelated with the state's ever-expanding quest to consolidate power for itself. Are we surprised at all? I don't think so. As always, that's my 2 cents, and you can take it for what it's worth.